My name is Chris, and I'm a bookaholic. Okay, you guys, I want to talk about an author. Actually, I think I want to talk about a couple of authors today just to highlight them. I'm not going to do an exhaustive study on their work. I've read a huge majority of all of these authors I'm going to mention, and I plan to mention three. These are three of my favorite authors, certainly not in any particular order, but three authors that I automatically love. And partly it has to do with when I first read their works. And I'll do a little explaining as I go, but I won't bore you too much with the details. I'll try to get you some specifics on the books that I loved and why I love these authors. Certainly at the end, I'd love to hear what authors you love and why. Here's the first, David Morrell. And David Morrell is best known for creating a series of books around a central character, John Rambo. And what's interesting is that, of course, when you think of Rambo, you think of Sylvester Stallone and the cinematic hits that came out. Certainly, I loved those movies when I was younger, and I'm sure many of you have seen them as well. But the book is so much better. It's such an incredible kind of a take and analysis of what people felt like when they were coming home from that Vietnam War and felt displaced, not really sure what their role was. They knew what they had to do when it came to their military services. There really wasn't a lot of talk about post-traumatic stress disorder or the concerns with suicide and just kind of that reintegration into society, if you will. So you have a character that is very much looked down upon based on his appearance. He's a drifter. He's kind of just trying to figure out how to cope with and make do and be that person that he's going to be now back into civilian life. And of course, the sheriff in this little itty-bitty town is not going to have any of that in terms of giving him some peace and quiet. He's ushered, as you know, away from that small town, and there's such a just a disrespect, and there's such tension that builds throughout this book that you know that basically the poo's going to begin to hit the fan. And as you probably are aware, you know, John Rambo snaps, and he basically is going to battle that town and make his stand. And, you know, that comment, you know, he drew first blood, that idea was something that was really important. I mean, as far as John Rambo was concerned, he wanted to be left alone. But because of the series of events and the things and the ways that he was treated, he felt like he had to retaliate. And of course, it's not until his mentor's brought in that they can somehow begin to make things settle down, possibly. And yet the ending of this book is so much more intense and shocking than what I had first assumed it would be based on the movies. So while you may have seen the movies and maybe you didn't like them, this book stands on its own as a great story. And David Morrell is a very interesting character. He's very active on Twitter. Predominantly, he spends that time trying to promote some of his books, and understandably so. But if you have a question or interact with him, he's been very kind to interact back. And I remember once when it came to dialogue and discourse about future movie adaptations with the character that he created, he really didn't get a lot of say. So at the end of the day, he's certainly the creator of Rambo. But that's not really the reason that I fell in love with this writer. The reason I fell in love with David Morrell as a writer, and he's recognized by so many as like the grandfather of the thriller novel. This guy knows how to write in a way that caused me to keep turning the pages super fast. And I really, really loved my exposure, probably that first encounter with David Morrell in his book called The Brotherhood of the Rose. And this is a pretty beat up, well-worn copy. But I remember reading this book and being awed by the way that he created these characters, the betrayal, the desire for integrity, these seemingly average guys and their skill set, and having to basically figure out ways to survive and how do you defend yourself, and ultimately the people that you care about who can suddenly turn on you. When I read this book, I remember thinking to myself, like, this guy knows his stuff. And the more that you read and learn about David Morrell, you realize that he's the kind of author that fully immerses himself into that character. So he took classes on flying planes, and he learned how to make knives, or the craftsmanship of what it would take to create a knife that would be used in a fight. And did all of these trainings for covert operations. And it's pretty exciting because when you're reading the book, you realize this guy knows what he's talking about. David Morrell has a ton of other books. He's a master of short stories. He has a collection of them. He has books that deal with kind of investigating and exploring abandoned buildings. And in all of it, it has this kind of a little bit of an undercurrent of some horror and creepiness to it, but it also has that fast-paced tendency that I actually see often in another author named Blake Crouch, and I would assume that Blake Crouch has probably been well-read and well-versed in the world of David Morrell. In addition to the short stories and, of course, the Rambo character and the Bread of the Hood of the Rose series, he has books that look at photography, and he has a deep love for the Western genre, and so he has books that fall in stride with that. But he also has some works, and specifically a nonfiction work that is called Fireflies. This book is it's pretty sad in a way. This is a book that he wrote about the loss of his son. It was a very unique disease, and then unfortunately it showed up again in a grandchild, if I recall. And to me, I was really fascinated with his fast-paced thriller writings, and I read everything I could get my hands on. But when I read this, I realized what an ache and a loss. And so while it seems like David Morrell is really good about writing, about loss and death, it can be very violent even at times. You might think to yourself, well, here's a guy that obviously just thinks that this is just simply entertainment. But he went through the horror of losing a child, and occasionally you'll see characters within that book and a variety of his books who struggle with a terminal disease and a sickness that really transforms and changes that character. If you're interested, you can find out a lot more about David Morrell. If you look on Twitter, he's there, and certainly tons of his books are available. I've read pretty much everything he's ever written, and will continue to do so. But I will make one more mention about David Morrell and his writing that I super loved, and that was his series, Murder as a Fine Art, where he looks at Thomas de Quincey and his daughter in around 1850-55 London. It is dirty and difficult times. This character, who is very unique in that he is addicted to laudanum, which is like opium, and his accounts of that addiction, he finds himself in scenarios where he has to help solve crimes. And it's so well researched. And I'm not surprised because, again, David Morrell, to me, is the kind of author who does his research and tries to create, yes, a fast-paced, action-packed book, but he wants it to be authentic. And so he brings in various moments that actually happened historically, and you find yourself in rooms and scenarios that would be true to that time. He did a lot of research, and I really appreciated that, and I loved those books. Those 3 books in the series, the Murder as a Fine Art and Inspector of the Dead, and the 3rd book in the series, Ruler of the Night. When I think about authors that I love and authors that have really kind of made a difference in my life, certainly David Morrell fit in that category. And while I loved him a lot earlier in my reading career, there have been other authors that have kind of swept the rug out from under me in terms of surprising me and inviting me into a whole new way of reading. And that brings to mind an author that very few people know about. Kent Haruf, forgive me, wrote a number of books, but unfortunately has passed away since. And so while I fell in love with Kent Haruf's works, the truth is that this is kind of all I get. And what makes this especially difficult is that when I read his books for the very first time, I found myself truly engaged and almost transported back into time when I was a little kid. The small town of Holt, Colorado really stood out to me. It reminded me a lot of the places that I grew up as a little boy, and it all began for me by reading this book right here called Plain Song. Plainsong basically introduces you to the world of Holt, Colorado. At least it did for me. I mean, this is the first one I read, and this is part of a trilogy, the first in the trilogy. And the reason I think that this stood out so much to me is that our primary characters is, one, a teacher, and two, are these two brothers who basically are single men who run their farm, and are old men who basically are obviously not very good at relational experiences. Neither are married, nor have they been married, and they don't certainly have any kids at all. They're pretty awkward and don't have a lot to say. Even though they've been together pretty much inseparably since they were younger, these two guys are almost one person. And even then, it's incomplete. So what's fascinating is that in this story, we're introduced to a young lady who finds herself to be pregnant and is out on her own and needs help. And these two brothers get wrangled into and invited into caring for this girl and the new baby. And the moments of awkwardness and the difficulties in communicating and trying to figure out what to do and how to be around another person besides their brother, it makes for a pretty powerful and engaging read. I actually was so moved by this book that I have recommended it to numbers of people, and whenever I find someone that's familiar with Kent Haruf's writing, it is almost like a long-lost friend has been found. Let me just say this. I recognize that this kind of writing is not for everyone, but for me, it is very profound. Small-town America, very intentional and simplistic, almost Hemingway-esque kind of writing style. It is followed by Eventide. Eventide kind of picks up with some of the other familiar characters, and then you are brought to Benediction, and these three books make up that trilogy surrounding yourself in Holt with some familiar characters. But some of these other books that are there, and this one here, Our Souls at Night, was a book that was found after he had passed away. They realized that he had completed this book, and so they put it together and made it available. For me, there's only one book that I have not read, this one here, The Tie That Binds. And part of the reason I haven't read this yet is because I'm afraid that once I finish this, of course, there's no more books that will be coming. And so if you've ever fallen, in love with an author and you are so captivated with their writing style, to find out that they're no longer alive or that they're not going to be able to put forth those masterpieces that you've enjoyed so much, it's a bit of a loss, to say the least. And so I find myself holding back and hesitant to read this book. Now, there is one other one, Where You Once Belonged, which I believe I read on an e-reader. I kind of like small town stories, and so it's probably why, in a lot of ways, I really like Stephen King's writing, and he would be the third author that I would introduce, because Stephen King, for me, isn't just a thriller writer and a horror writer, but he's the kind of guy that places these stories into a familiar small town, Castle Rock. And many of you have read numerous books by King, that constant reader. And for me, there's something about running into those familiar characters throughout the books that is kind of something that I know. I get, when you grow up in a small town, everybody kind of knows each other's business. There's talk. There's kind of an understanding. And whenever I happen upon books like that, it immediately draws me in. Of course, one of those examples is Stephen King's It. And this book has unnerved and freaked out a huge majority of people. Why? Because, first of all, there's clowns, but also because you have these characters that you kind of see and experience. You see their story. You're reminded this. I remember this. This is kind of like my childhood to a degree. The competitions and the fights or the arguments or the playing and the fort building and the this and the that, the difficult homes that they go to. And then you see them them later on in life as adults, and they're trying to process and deal with all of the stuff that they began to experience when they were younger, and it continues to follow them as adults. In a lot of ways, I think that that's so common for us as adults, to think back on certain kind of moments and experiences in our life from our past that were so powerful and profound, and yet they kind of hang on, and many of us have still struggled with a variety of horrors from our past in our present. And I think that there is something intentional about that in these kind of books. When you look at The Shining, with young Danny Torrance, and of course later on with Dr. Sleep, the truth is that you're going to watch this progression of what happens. In a lot of King's books, he has that small kid growing up into, this particular person, trying to come to grips with who they are and the uniqueness of who they are. Think of course, Firestarter. And also the book Revival by King was another one that I felt like was phenomenal. It was an outstanding book. I didn't think it was going to be as good as it was. But whether you're talking about Dolores Claiborne, where you see the story of a dysfunctional family, Carrie, of course, which is another one of those examples of a story where there's a family that is just completely unhinged, and then this girl, in a way, the only way that she possibly could retaliate or defend herself, kind of shows up, and it culminates to this intense climax. Books like Cujo, even, where you're following this progression of that young boy. I would be remiss without mentioning this book. What I loved about this especially was that you, of course, are familiar enough with the story, even if you haven't read this, by having seen the movie. But the truth is, this book's ending is very different than the movie, and it's worth that alone for reading it, to read it. The Dead Zone, The Dark Half, you name it, these books are pretty legendary books, but oftentimes these characters start out in that small town, in a small town feel. You recognize these people, and he causes you and invites you to care for those folks, and then ultimately he starts messing with them, and that's one of the great, amazing gifts that King has. So there's just a few authors, David Morrell and Kent Haruf and Stephen King, that I personally love, and I'd love to hear about some of the authors that you love, and maybe some of the books that stood out for you as well. So I know this is nowhere near an exhaustive list on why I love these authors, nor is it in the particular order, but I will simply say this, that those three authors for me, I'm all in on. So until next time.